Once upon a time, on Twitter, a brilliant artist named Meg Frank spoke their desires to the internet. And because this desire was a great idea and would make people happy, their friends and an institution of higher learning made it come true, adjusted for availability. Welcome to the Sparkle Salon, where a group of multifaceted writers and scientists get to be as wonky as they want about their research, their work, and anything else they feel like talking about. And you get to listen in. Enjoy. Hi, everyone. So good to see you all, as always. Welcome. We know that Amal can't make it today, and we're waiting to see if Annalie can. But for the moment, we're gonna start chatting. And I know, Karen, you wanted to talk a little bit about the Bocas Lit Festival.
Yes, the Vocals Lit Fest. I was there at the end of April this year. And I have to say, for those of you who've never followed this, I am from Barbados. I live in Barbados. Vocals Lit Fest is held in Trinidad, which is about an hour's plane trip to the south. And I think of it as my home festival. I really do. It's the place where, I listen, I've been to festivals and conventions and conferences in the US and the UK and whatever, and I love my colleagues dearly, but there's something about being in a Caribbean literary space where, because you feel totally at home, because you share the same references, cultural references, because you share the same language, it's actually a very relaxing space for me. And, and it's also a very, I would call it almost like a multimedia space. You're flowing from prose to poetry to film. There's always a lot of there's artwork around, there's references to artwork. So there's a way in which the whole concept of story is always in a very expansive kind of way. And I really, really like that because I'm so sorry, but North American and kind of like UK marketing is just so fixated on its boxes.
No, you're right.
It's genre boxes, it's like you're in this box and you stay here and you can't. But you go there and people will talk to you who are literary and it's all very inclusive and welcoming and whatever, and you have amazing conversations, you have all these cross references, and it's absolutely brilliant. I'm going to talk about just one panel. I was on stage with Miriam Chansey, who is an amazing Haitian author, and also with Christina Sharp, who recently got a Wyndham Campbell Prize, actually. And I just, first of all, it was one of those panels where you're like, wow, yeah, I'm really above my pay grade in this company here. But then the level of conversation you have is just so incredible that you feel yourself, growing 3 sizes larger than you were before, because they're challenging you, they're making you think of things a particular way, express things in this particular way. And it started me thinking again about how I would love to have more of I don't know how to do this, an established community of creatives. And I say creatives because I don't think it should just be SF people. I don't think it should be just writers. But, if you could just have some kind of structure, and I know that some of the writers associations and so on have something similar, but you have a structure where you kind of pool your resources in terms of things like chasing down payments, contracts, dealing with taxes, all the look at your face, right? all the sort of the annoying admin stuff that takes away our creative time. So you have that structure, but, and this is just my dream, you also have this one big room, both real and virtual, where you can just sit down and have a chat with people and talk about cool stuff. And it doesn't have to be just one genre or just one format. And you're just enjoying story. And like I said, you also are sharing resources that take the non-creative pressures off of you. That's my dream. I'm just putting it out there.
Yes, please.
Just a perpetual writer's retreat.
95% of what you're talking about is a union.
Plus a guild plus retreat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Union, yeah.
Yeah. and this is actually, and I don't have the legal background to really get into the depths of why in the US at least writers can't unionize. Like there isn't a way to be recognized as a union the way that our screenwriter and journalist friends and colleagues can. But fiction writers are considered to be basically in competition with each other and therefore aren't a collective bargaining group.
It's a
yeah,
lie.
I know.
They're trying to divide and
I
conquer.
know. And and again, I can't go much deeper because I'm not a lawyer and I haven't really delved into this in the way that someone who's a specialist in labor law could. But the fact that we can't unionize is a thing that I think is a huge problem. And I mean, a union doesn't necessarily provide all of the social and intellectual benefits that you were talking about, Karen, but it does provide a lot of the solidarity benefits that an organization like the one you were talking about would allow. And I mean, we have tiny bits of it in different places, but it's not got the same power. And we don't have things like model contracts and guarantees, and it would be a very, very different realm if we could have something like that in the US. But then I've been on a huge thinking about unionization kick lately in a lot of parts of, I guess, my my non-work professional life. So, and part of that is I read some really interesting things by an American author named Hamilton Nolan, who recently put a book out called The Hammer, which is a history of unions in America and why they're such a mess right now and how they might get better, which I highly recommend. I really enjoyed reading it. He's a great writer, which is always a bonus. But, oh, go ahead.
Just had a question. So what's the difference between a union and a guild? Like, I feel like a guild could be something that would be not like legally recognized, but serve a lot of the same purposes. Is that?
That's a
Well,
good point.
I think the difference is that a union can collectively bargain, can create a binding contract with a management company. And a guild is more of a sort of, it's a kind of mutual aid society in a very formalized way. The Authors Guild has sued some of the artificial intelligence companies for scraping online versions of authorial work without compensation, but the Authors Guild can't negotiate a contract that applies to all of its members.
Right. That would still do a lot of what Karen is talking about, I think. Sounds like.
Yeah. It never has in a way that I've
No.
seen, like the part where there's the conversation, but then a union doesn't necessarily do that either.
Maybe I'm thinking of like Middle Ages type guilds where you had mentorship and apprentices baked into apprenticeships baked in.
And you have like the meetings in the sort of basement with the candlelight and everything. Yeah.
Secret rituals. We could come up with some really
rituals.
good ones.
Oh,
we could.
Oh, we need rituals.
Of writers. Okay, this is going to be a bit of a segue. If you want to return to this topic, we can. But I actually have to say, I was going to ask Katie more about flying anyway. But I'm particularly curious whether non-professional pilots who are in this sort of like small, medium-sized planes, do you have any rituals? I mean, I know there are things for sailors. I know there are things like, you cross the equator and then weird stuff happens and whatever. What do you have for your like goalposts in terms of rituals?
There are a couple of rituals around like when you do your first solo. There's one that I didn't do it, but is still frequently practiced where like the way it's supposed to go is after you do your first solo, the instructor like cuts a piece out of the back of your shirt, and so that you have like sort of tails, and I think it's something to do with like this idea that in the past, I mean, I don't know if this is true, but this is the story I've heard, that in the past, like when you're flying with an instructor, you're in the front seat and the instructor's behind you, and they like tug on your shirt to tell you to like communicate with you because it's too loud in the plane to hear these old style planes, and so they can kind of like lead you by tugging on your shirt. And so when you cut off the back of your shirt, it's to symbolize the instructor isn't there behind you anymore.
I love that.
But that is a thing, like I still see like on Instagram or whatever, when people post about first solo, you know, you still see people wearing these like t-shirts with like a shirt, a piece cut out of the back. So that's kind of a ritual, kind of rite of passage.
Like
Sorry?
yanking at someone's shirt to tell them where to go and just pulling harder and harder if they don't listen. This is kind of
I mean, I guess I don't I fly, the one of the planes I fly is in that configuration, but we just have the radio, so like we can talk through our headsets. We don't need any like anybody tugging on anybody. So there's that. Other than that, like I don't think that there's much that's like really ritualized. I mean, we have so many procedures that sort of sound like rituals when you do them, because you're going through like checklists and sort of like talking through like a pre-takeoff briefing, you know, and that's supposed to be done basically the same way every time. And you talk through like when I was first learning, there was, you know, every time we were taxiing to the runway, we would do this pre-takeoff briefing, and it was like, you know, we're going on runway 32, and if something goes wrong on the runway, we stay on the runway. If something goes wrong after takeoff, we land straight ahead. If we're above 1,000 feet, we turn around and come back to the airport. You know, and it's to get in your mind like, okay, here are the steps you take. And you know, when I was first learning, I was thought like this seems silly to do this every time. We do this every time. I know the ritual, the procedures, but because you do it every time, it kind of just brings it to the front of your mind. And now that I'm doing some training in a multi-engine airplane, and there's different procedures for like if one of the engines quits as you're taking off, and so there's this whole thing that you're supposed to go through when you're coming up to the runway, like, you know, if it quits at this point, we do this. If it quits at this point, you do this. And some of these briefings can be, you know, it can take you like 30 seconds to get through all of the steps. But it does feel very ritualized. But it's serving this purpose of keeping putting everything into the front of your mind, so that it's very quick to access.
It's automating your response.
Yeah, and you know, when you like again with the multi-engine flying, there's a process for if one of the engines quits on climb out, there's this specific set of steps you have to do pretty quickly, because otherwise very, very bad things happen. And if you do them, you can fly the plane away. You're not gonna, you know, it's not like with a single engine airplane where the engine dies, you're a glider now, right? With two engines, you have options, but you have to do things very quickly. And so there's a thing called the drill, which is like, the engine quits, you pitch for blue line, you do mixtures, props, throttles, flaps, gear, and then you do identify which engine, verify by moving the throttle, bring back feather the propeller, bring back the mixture, and that you like part of the training is that you just go over that over and over and over again, so you have it like very quickly in your head, because you cannot think when an emergency occurs. You literally cannot in that kind of situation. And so it has to be in your brain, and it has to be in your body. Like when I was telling you that I was like moving my hand around, you have to you know where everything is, and you have to be like doing the motions as well as part of that. And that's how you put that into your head, so that when you're sort of triggered by the actual event, it'll just happen. And so much of aviation is learning that motion memory or body memory, or connecting things. Like putting things into a different part of your brain that's not conscious, but is just like quick access, you know, sort of automatic. And it's been really fascinating as a process to go through trying to learn something not intellectually but bodily, or
It reminds me of learning
instinctively.
music. I was a
Yeah,
pianist
yeah.
for a long time as a kid. My family are musicians. So I started playing piano when I was about 5, and played very, very seriously till I was 16, and thought about going to conservatory and ended up not doing that for various reasons. But what you're talking about, that kind of other memory, the non-intellectual learning
Yeah.
that is deeply physicalized, that has,
Mhm.
and I mean, music is different, obviously, but piano has this, you're using both of your hands to do different things at the same time. And one of the things that young classical pianists are trained to do is to play pieces by memory. And one of the things I will never forget about doing that a lot was the way that I hadn't actually memorized every note of the piece. I had memorized sequences that were physical. So there were places I could start and places I couldn't.
Right.
It's true.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
could not remember how to start from like measure 3, but I could start from measure 1 of a section and play measure 3 perfectly.
Right.
But
Right.
I love that
Yeah.
physicalization and like seeing you
Yeah.
do it, super cool.
Yeah, yeah, it's a very, yeah, it's a fascinating thing, and it's fascinating to see just how effective that can be, and you can learn things without having any idea how you're doing them. Like when I learned to fly tailwheel airplanes, which is the landing gear is in a different configuration, the plane is horrendously unstable on the ground for reasons of where the center of mass is. And anyway, you have to learn to use the rudders to keep the plane straight in a way that you just don't have to do with other kinds of airplanes. And when I first tried it, I was utterly incapable. I could not do it. I was reacting too slowly. The plane was weaving around. I was, in danger of crashing at all times. And then, but now, like, I can just do it, and I absolutely do not think about it, and I could not think about it, and it just took doing it a lot. And I was just the other day, I was looking one of the like pilot training courses that I get emails from. They were sending out this thing about there's like this tailwheel flying course, online course that they're putting together, and I'm just like, there's no point. Like, like you can talk through this as much as you want, but until you're in the plane doing it, like you have to physically learn that. Like, I don't know how, like, there are things you can learn in a simulator, there are things you can learn on paper, but that is not one of them. And I can't fathom trying to learn something like that at an intellectual level, because I knew, like, I can tell you about the physics of exactly where the center of mass is and how the angular momentum is happening, like what's going wrong, in terms of the physics. I can do that. I can draw out all the diagrams, but I could not control the plane until I'd spent like 5 hours doing it. And it's just fascinating to me how the brain, like, and with aviation, you're using those different kinds of learning so much, because you're also learning about, like, navigation procedures and a whole lot of like conversion factors and rules of thumb with math and airplane systems, all this stuff. There is a huge intellectual aspect, but there's also just, your body has to do the thing, and you have to train your body, and you have to train this unconscious part of your mind constantly. And I think that's one of the things that I love so much about it, is that it does use every part of, like, I don't know, the sort of mind body connection. That it's just such a cool thing to experience, learning all those different kinds of things.
That's really cool. And it also, it reminds me of when I was learning Japanese, and I would look at kanji for a while and look at them, turn it over, and I couldn't draw them. And then after I had spent some time in Japan and was like staring at them everywhere, and somehow it clicked, so that, I couldn't automatically read them, obviously, if I didn't know them, but suddenly my brain was able to remember the images in a way that it hadn't. And it was like such a clear moment. Like I actually remember the first one, which was from a license plate. It was the first kanji in the place where I lived, the prefecture I lived, but I knew it was from looking at it on license plates while I was stuck in traffic. And I was lying in bed and I could see it. And that was, it was such a just shift of my brain going like, oh, fine. Okay, now we're gonna, remember, find this totally different way.
That's happened to me on a much smaller level with different alphabets, because I've never learned a pictogram language, a language like Japanese or Chinese, but I have learned some Russian, and I've learned quite a bit of Armenian, and both of those use an alphabet that's not the Latin alphabet, and Greek also, only to read, not to speak. But there's a point where you go from being able to recognize the letters and doing a kind of decoding in your head where, okay, that shape makes this sound, to the way that I read in my native language in English, which is just, there's no point at which those shapes don't make the sounds. I'm not aware of the processing. But there's a flip over point, and it's happened to me 3 times with 3 other alphabets, so I'm very aware of it.
Yeah.
And it also can go away if you don't read the alphabet for a long time.
But I would also argue that in English is actually, and maybe other languages, but I don't know, I think English specifically, because it's not phonetic, is not so different from logogram languages or pictogram languages, because we read words, I think, once we get to...
You read the shape of the word and not so much the letters.
Yeah, it's
oh goodness, you've just described my childhood, because I think my mother did a lot of teaching when I was really little, and she taught me on these like flashcards where it would be like airplane, picture of an airplane, the word airplane, and I'm really bad at spelling verbally. Like I gotta write it down first and then I can spell it. I don't have the letters assembled in my head, but it's just like you said, you're looking at the shape of the word. And especially as I need like magnifiers as I get older, it actually works for me pretty well. But you're looking at the shape of the word, and it just like jumps into your head like that, and it also helps you, I think, to read a lot more quickly at a far younger age, which is how you become a full-fledged nerd.
One of the ways you can.
One of the ways, yes. Wait, hang on. I just want to point out that when you were talking about being surrounded by the text, I just had like there was a point where I started getting more and more into various foreign films, but especially any films that had to do with martial arts, because this was when I was younger, starting getting Tai Chi and whatever. And I still remember, especially when you have the cityscapes, because cities especially are filled with text. There's always store signs, there's always billboards, there's always neon flashing things going on, in addition to your license plates. And I felt really offset being in a textually rich environment that was opaque to me. I was like, I want to learn this simply because even if it just says 1, 2, 3, I need to know. Because I'm so accustomed to just like being in that space.
Yeah.
So I was going to actually ask you that license plate click, that the changing of your environment to a textually rich one that you could not understand to one that you could understand. How many months did that take? Because I'm willing to put in the work. I'm willing to like travel somewhere and like get that experience.
It's totally worth it. It's also, I mean, that click that I was talking about was really about my brain being able to remember the shape in a way that it couldn't before that. Or like, I think before it, I could remember to read sometimes, because I studied for a year in college before I went. So I had some ideas that I could read, but I couldn't write. I couldn't remember it to write without looking at it exactly in front of me. So that was that specific. But there were, and it was also, I have to say, a process, because I remember, and I'm similar. Like if I see something, I want to know, and so I would be there, and I would have all these, my internal monologue would be like, well, that says go something, and also Japanese is like English in that the writing system is grafted onto a different indigenous language that it doesn't quite fit. And so Japanese is extra fun, where you have these characters, can have different readings, like dramatically different readings, not like conjugation, but like it'll say a totally different sound depending on what it's complicated. Anyway, so like I'm reading this and I'm like, okay, I don't know how that's pronounced, but I know what it means. And that one is pronounced this way. And I just have this like patchwork of different kinds of understanding going around. But I also remember when I'd been in Japan for like, I don't know, half a year or something, I went to Thailand on a holiday and I got there, and was driving. And I remember driving from the airport, just staring really hard at all.
I just had this experience in Thailand.
Stare hard enough, I'll understand, because I did that in Japan. But of course, when I did it in Japan, it came with a lot of study and work. And now I'm like, and it does not work. You have to actually learn the alphabet first. But I think it's totally worth it. And I think if you do like a little study, it can happen pretty fast. I remember also when I moved to Sri Lanka, I studied the alphabet of Sinhalese before I went.
Wow.
Again, on a long car ride. Maybe the weekend after I got there. And I was, again, like staring at everything. But then I was trying to piece it together. And I finally got together one word out of the different letters that I remembered and the many that I didn't. And the word I finally got was super, as in supermarket, which was transliterated. And I was like, okay, yay, I read something. Kind of boo, it's not actually technically in that language, but still, yay, I read something. So yeah, it's a great experience. I think the experience of going into a situation where you're out of your depth and out of your comfort zone and learning from the child position is just so worthwhile. So yeah, tried to do that a lot.
I wonder if speculative writers in particular love that being out of our depth thing. I mean, the whole learning something completely new, whether it's to challenge your mind or your body or both or whatever. Because I know so many other people who are kind of like, I'm in my comfort zone. I worked hard to get here. How dare you suggest I step out of it? So yeah, I wonder if this is just like part of the makeup of why we do what we do as well.
Maybe. I mean, I consciously try to replicate that experience in the world building in my books because I love the experience so much that I feel like I want my books to be like that. And that's, and then people say like, okay, it's confusing at the beginning, but then you catch up. And that's what I want. That is featured up. I mean, I understand it's not featured
That's how being in the world is. It's confusing and then you catch up.
And I totally, like, I'm not saying everyone should enjoy this about my books. Always hit the balance right, because it's a tricky balance. What's enough information and too much information. It's different for everyone and different for people at different times, depending on what book you're coming from. There's definitely moments when I've just read a fantasy novel and I go into a new one and I'm like, I have to memorize new continent names. But then after I've read some other things, I'll come back to and be like, yes, tell me about an entire different place. I want all the lore and I want to be someplace totally different. So I'm not saying that it has to work all the time for everyone, but that is what I'm going for because I love it. And this is a different way to do it.
I'm going to say something heretical. I think one of the reasons I started to fall out of love with epic fantasy, with all the maps and the genealogies and the different names and so on, was that I found that pockets of the real world so much more fascinating that I was like, I decline to now fill my brain with fictional knowledge that will basically end with this book or this series, when I could be filling it with something that's in the present world. And I know that's extremely heretical to say and totally counter to our readership, and I do apologize, but I have kind of fallen out of love with it. I think that when I couldn't travel, I think that when I didn't have opportunities, it was more like, oh, I've got this brain that wants this stuff, so I will, fix onto whatever is possible, even if it's fictional. But now I can travel. Now I can go and learn these other things. I'm like, okay, that was my sort of stepping stone. That was my stopgap measure, and now I can like just do the real thing.
I get that, but from a different angle, I guess, because for me, I'm instinctively a science fiction writer. I write science fiction unless I'm trying really hard not to. So I mean that happens in like every genre. I tried to write like straight mystery crime and could not do it. It was immediately accidentally sci-fi. But so sometimes I come to the desire for the experience of really foreign travel, which I also really love. Like, it's one of the things that is the best thing in the world for me, is to get to go someplace I've never been and get properly lost. And sometimes I think this has made me have very weird standards for a lot of speculative fiction, because I want to feel as thrown out of myself as I do when I travel, when I come to a world that is supposed to be radically different from the one I'm in. And I mean, this does have the counter effect of making the ones that do that, the books that have that experience, like, so good. Like, the remarkableness of that is wonderful for me.
I'm gonna say I have the same thing. I'm a little more, I think, I'm okay with science fiction that's sometimes not totally different, but I have a real problem with historical novels that feel like they're set today. Like,
don't even start, Dan. Don't even start.
Part of the reason I generally don't write historical novels, because I don't want to do the level of research that will be required for me to, and but it doesn't even, like, it's not even like everything has to be exactly right in the details. I just don't want to feel like, and I don't mind a little ahistorical language that feels like it's sort of, I don't know, intentional or fits with the whole aesthetic, but like the ones where it just feels like the whole mindset is super super in the modern, I bounce so hard. And I think it is that, like, yeah, I want to be, if I'm going to, okay, this is a deep cut, but there's this book of essays by Jorge Luis Borges called 7 Nights, which were lectures he gave, and one of them he talks about having a dream nightmare vision of an ancient king somehow, like, sitting on his bed, and he said, I knew he was ancient, or I knew he was from a different era because he looked fundamentally different from us. And I think it's just so powerful. I should reread that because I'm probably totally mangling the quote, but like it was this, like, okay, there was something actually different in the way people were, 1,000 years ago, and obviously things that were fundamentally the same too. Like, I don't want to say, like, to have that, the sense of the way that culture and society have changed since then, is such an invigorating experience that I just hate books that, like, sort of pretend they're just like, oh, we want the dresses, but everything else is the same. Cute, like, don't get me wrong, but I want that.
I think one of the things that I really enjoy about science fiction in particular is that feeling of being in that, unfamiliar place, where you don't understand what's going on, you're trying to figure out, but like, if it's well done, you can figure it out. Like, there are clues and it's a coherent structure, and it's a logical thing that fits together. And I think that's one of the things that I find it a lot harder to find in fantasy, which is part of why I don't read as much fantasy, is because I feel like a lot of the, like, there's more sort of
hand-waving.
A lot of the fantasy books I read are just more kind of like casual about that. Like, there's not that you don't have these rigid rules and structure, and like,
I want to argue against that now.
Okay.
Because there's a movement in fantasy that is trying to provide, I think, that sense of structure that you're talking about, that actually for me does not work at all. So, and this is and again, this is a for me problem, not a for people problem. But this comes out of, like, role-playing games and having a magical system that has very precise rules, and like, oh, you use this many points to do X thing. Like, and I try not to get into arguments on the internet with people who want, like, an explanation of the well, what's the specific set of rules in what rule book did you make this magical thing happen from? And I understand the impulse to sort of systematize from two angles. One of them is, I think, closer to what you were talking about, Katie, which is the sense of having a holistic working system that is complete or could be complete, that is suggested by what is in the page. And there's another one that just comes from liking systematic in general. I mean, I like spreadsheets. I like putting things into little categories and seeing how they fit together. It's I recognize the impulse, guys. But at the same time, there's a disenchantment that comes out of that. And
hang on a second.
where I do find
wondering if you
fantasy.
So I was wondering if you might actually be on the same page, because
We might be.
maybe the question is not whether there are rules or are not rules, but how complex the rule system is. I think sometimes in some kind of fantasy works, when you give me, as you say, this whole very like Dungeons and Dragons, this is precisely how the magic works and so on, all I can think to myself is the real world that I live in, the rules are there, but they are actually so complex, so complicated, so many like levels to them, that no one human being really has the full grasp. But you're presenting to me a world where things are maybe just a tad too simplistic. So I feel like I'm looking at a picture with very big pixels, as opposed to something which is so finely grained that it's a lot smoother. And I kind of recognize what Katie's talking about, in the sense that there's some fantasy novels where I feel I can't pick it up because they're like, there's no nuance in your magic system. There's no what if. There's no sense of discovery of, no, we don't actually know exactly how this works yet. And the ones that aren't as certain about things are the ones I am actually more willing to give a pass to.
Maybe
I was just gonna say, Karen, you said once something to me, or to, I don't remember if it was actually in a Sparkle Salon or in a different conversation that we have, but you said once something about how the books, it was really important to you that books had a sense of the numinous. And I think it's funny, but possible that something that is a fantasy novel that has to do with magic can lose that sense of something beyond, if they know everything that if they know how everything works and it's all done by, I don't want to put the blame on numbers exactly, but like if it's all so planned out and so clockwork, then that can be missing. And I mean, I just said how sometimes I'm like, I cannot memorize more names of places. Like, I feel both of you on this, but I also think that so much of it has to do with execution too.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And maybe there's part of it is like trying to systematize the wrong things. Like in really good science fiction, the rules of the physics of the universe, and they can be very simple or they can be very complex, but like you have a kind of coherent picture of like, okay, this can happen, this can't happen, this technology exists, this technology does not exist, like this is how that all works together. But there's a lot of freedom within that for interesting changes in society and how people deal with things. And if you have a system where, a world where the people are systematized very clearly, but the physics is kind of all over the place, that I find harder to connect with, I think. Maybe that's where my where I bounce off things.
Yeah, it's a shame too, because I feel like there's some fantasy that's doing just such sharp political analysis and like social, but you do have to kind of go with it long enough. You do have to memorize at least some. You do have to also, like, the other thing I struggle with sometimes in fantasy is to resist the easy analogizing of real world places, right? And sometimes
that happens in science fiction too.
It happens, absolutely. And sometimes you're not even supposed to resist. Sometimes they're like, yes, this is fantasy wherever. But sometimes that makes it actually harder to see the points they're making.
Mhm.
And that's something that I see coming up a lot with audiobooks. I read mostly with audiobooks these days, just because I can do it when I'm doing other things. And sometimes you get a narrator who has decided that certain characters have certain accents, and that narrator is putting a cultural stamp on different people, and you're like, and you're not sure whether that's what the author intended, but also it feels like it's pushing you into certain kinds of ways of thinking of the different people, and sometimes I'm like, I don't know how comfortable I am with that. Like, is that person supposed to sound Welsh, or like, you're just like, I don't know.
My narrator is very steeped. My narrator is Robin Miles, very steeped in accents, and in a way, accents are, I think I pay a lot of attention to, because I'm in the Caribbean region, because we do have a grand variation of accents, not just by virtue of which island you're from, or which country you're from, but also by virtue of your ancestors' country of origin. There may be certain words in your vernacular and whatever. I mean, it does all creolize together, but there's still a sense there of kind of coming to a crossroads of cultures. And yes, my narrator has done that, has done the whole give a particular character a particular accent, but in a very, I think, a very sort of like nuanced sort of way, because she's taken the cues of the names I've chosen. So if I've chosen a name that definitely, okay, well, this is a South Indian name or whatever, that kind of signals to her. And whenever she's out of her depth, like the first time I really met her was Galaxy Game. I did the foolish thing of deciding that there was this first person character who had to have his own accent, because this is a different planet, so I can't use an Earth accent. So I'm like making this thing up from scratch. I'm like, why am I doing this? But sometimes things just carry you along, and you're like, okay, obviously this is how he wants to talk. So she wanted to discuss that with me. What was he going to sound like? This is a completely invented accent, and it was really curious because she took his personality in a way, a little bit of con man, a little bit, very scrappy youngster trying to get ahead and whatever, and just like added in a bit of like, sort of like streetwise London, plus a little bit of like, this bit here and this bit there, so that there are enough cultural echoes, references from the Earth point of view, that then when you hear it, and yes, he's from a different planet, but you've already kind of thought about various movies in which you heard similar characters, and it's enough to make you think, oh, he's that kind of person. And I thought, well, that is adding a level and a layer that just the text doesn't do, and I found that fascinating. See, this is why I don't want to be in boxes. It's like people who have things to teach you about how to expand my story.
No, I love that. I think there's probably some smart person should write a dissertation or a master's thesis on the use of British accents in American film, and the class signaling and level of villainy signaling that British
Oh
accents
my gosh. Do you remember the wolves in Narnia have American accents?
I didn't watch the movies because that seemed vaguely like sacrilegious to the child I once was.
Wow. Okay.
But no, the choice of when to use a British accent and when to use an American accent in a fantasy film, there is a huge history of that, and a really, really interesting one that I can sort of see the shape of, because Americans don't like to remember that we also do class signaling, but we do. And one of the ways that we do it is by borrowing the accents of the people who colonized America and who some of us used to be. And that class signaling is very complex. As someone who has an inexplicable transatlantic accent based on growing up in a very strange way, no one knows what to do with me occasionally. So I noticed this one.
I think that's true. And it's interesting too, when you think about it, how one of the ways of signifying class in British context is using the language and the writing system of the French who colonized England and who we used to be. And it's well, anyway, this all goes back to your books, Arkady. So
yeah, a little. I'm just deeply interested in what language does.
Yeah.
And like what speaking different languages at different registers do.
Yeah.
That's something I'd love to write about in the future, actually, because in the books I've done so far, in that universe, in the Texcolan universe, I've mostly dealt with people who were either native speakers of Texcolanli or non-native speakers of Texcolanli, but all of them working at a very high class level.
Mm.
And I haven't really explored vernacular, and I would really be interested in thinking about vernacular someday. I have to figure out the right story that goes in, but you know, there's a lot there.
Mm.
The other one that fascinates me is non-English languages that have explicit formality markers, like
Mhm. Like
the
Japanese.
like Japanese, yeah. Although, well, I was thinking more about like French or Spanish that have formal or informal you,
Mm.
and
Oh
how
yeah.
that changes in different countries, how the use changes in different countries. In Japan, there are very different formality registers in different parts of the islands, but it's a little different from the whole like colony that has, you know, I mean, there's whole forms of address in that are in common daily use in Latin America that are antiquated in Spain.
Mm.
And just wild amount of difference in terms of where you use the formal and not. And the same is true in French. And so it's so interesting, like how those things just evolve differently in different places.
I live in New Mexico, and I speak really bad Spanish, but my really bad Spanish is Nuyorican really bad Spanish because that's where I grew up. Um, which is like I grew up in Upper Manhattan, which so the people I spoke Spanish to when I spoke Spanish at all came from Puerto Rico, and they spoke a very New York dialect of Puerto Rican Spanish. So that's the rhythm in my head. And here in New Mexico, especially the northern half of New Mexico, there's people speaking what they call the dialect norteño Spanish, which is very much its own thing. It has a completely different rhythm. I can understand it, but I can't predict it. And it has forms that aren't used elsewhere because it's a lot of the people who are speaking it here, they come from the Spanish conquest in the 1600s, 1700s, and there's continuity. So really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah, also swears. Like I feel like these things at the margins are so interesting because swears are so different. Like there are words that are totally innocuous in one country and absolutely you do not say it unless you're ready to get real in other countries. And I mean, and we can see that in English as well, because like there's US UK stuff, or let's not bring in the Australian swearing. An Australian Boston who would just say the most ridiculous things and then be like, oh, sorry, I'm Australian. That's normal there. And he's absolutely taking the piss, but he could get away with it because there is actually a lot of that that's true. So, but the, you know, the different words that become just absolutely taboo, it's so fascinating. We are coming up on an hour. I'm just going to put that out in case anyone has to go.
Soon-ish.
I guess there's only one thing I want to say. At the time of this recording, the world continues to be on fire in unique ways. So if anyone is watching this and wondering why they can't even place when we're talking because we're just not talking about world events at all, it's too much. It's too much. You know, give us some time. There are things we're in the middle of, and I mean, even from previous Sparkle Salons, I think we learned a bit of that, where what we talk about at the time of recording, and then what is actually happening in the world by the time it gets posted. Sometimes you're like, wow, I almost wish I hadn't said that, or I would have said that with a bit more knowledge or whatever. But honestly, truthfully, there's just far too much happening right now, and it does feel a bit overwhelming. Although I have a strategy. Whenever I feel as if there are too many fires burning in the world and why is everything like just so much, I try to remember what was happening at particular times in my life when I thought things were calm, but all that was happening was I wasn't paying attention. And a combination of things I wasn't paying attention to, and also things that were not being broadcast at the time that you only found out after the fact. When I was watching the the series Chernobyl, which I found absolutely fascinating, and then started reading some of the background. What absolutely terrified me when I thought about what I was doing during that year, I didn't know the level of crisis that was going on. I was like, wow, okay, you know, I mean, I definitely had, that was actually the year that my mother died. That was the year I graduated. I mean, I had all kinds of stresses going on. But if I also had to be thinking about, there's this like runaway nuclear accident that might, you know, claim the entire world, I probably would have had a breakdown. It probably would have been like levels and layers of too much. So, you know, I don't know if this is not a reassuring statement, because I guess it just means that there are fires everywhere, even stuff we don't even know about. But you know, you kind of just have to sometimes focus on the fires that are in front of you, the ones you can do stuff about.
Sometimes just have a conversation with friends about
yes.
Have a conversation with friends, like, and go do something in your community. Just like hang out with people and do something that feels like you're changing a small thing, or just enjoying a small thing. Like you don't have to change a small thing, you just go be in the world.
And which is changing things, which is you know, participating and even not in your community, even just going for a walk in nature, and just
that is your community. Nature is part of your community. The nature where you are.
And learning something new, which we talked about a lot in this. I also have one thing to say, and I waited till the end because I give basically even odds on whether Karen will demand that we edit this out. But Karen, you were talking about the Book of Slit Fest, and you were talking about how like literature people would actually talk to you, and you were on this amazing panel that you actually said above your pay grade. And I just want to point out that your book was longlisted for the Women's Prize. You are therefore officially within that community of literature, and it was definitely not above your pay grade, because you are totally there and your books are amazing. So like I think, you know, we're
thank you.
It's hard to remind each other these things, because it's hard.
I go back and forth on it. Sometimes I'm like, yes, this is brilliant. Other times I'm like, oh gosh,
I mean,
this isn't that important.
But congratulations, it's a big thing, and it's really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, big hugs and to you all, and thank you for all the things that you do in the world.
Thank you.
And the big and the small, we gotta stop belittling the small. Even the ways in which sometimes you say something and you think it's throwaway, and sometimes someone comes back to you and we're like, oh, you said this and it really affected me. Just those kinds of things really remind me that you don't know where you're having an effect. So we have to stop being hung up on trying to look like the big damn hero all the time, and just like live sincerely and authentically, and you know, as to the highest that we can manage in the moment that we are in and the place that we are in. Sorry, that's a Sunday, but I didn't need to preach.
Great news to end on. Thank you all, and I hope to do this again soon.
Yeah, definitely.